Hey everyone, welcome into another episode of the Florida Sound Archive podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Kaiser, and today's episode features a guest who has been involved in the jazz music scene for over 30 years. Bruce Stalens is here originally from Central Florida in the Orlando area. So we're really excited to talk a lot about that and that period of time where he was definitely at the height of his career in Orlando. Bruce, how are you? Welcome into the podcast.
I'm doing well, Jeff. Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure having you on. So I know we have a lot to get to, a lot of different periods of your career we're going to be talking about today. And I know when we were first chatting prior to our interview today, we had to talk about the record behind you, the 45, because that is someone that was very important in the early years of your career. So I'd love to talk about that record. Willie Thomas, right?
Yes. So Willie was he was actually the first guy who put a trumpet in my hands back when I was 10 years old. He had a phenomenal career before he grew up in Orlando, moved away, went to New York, had quite a nice career in New York, lost his cabaret license, as many did back in the 60s, and moved back to Orlando, where he kind of co-started the Bandwagon Music Center, which was in Orlando. And so he and the rest of the faculty from Bandwagon came out to my middle school, and he put a trumpet in my hands, and that was the beginning of of a lot of fun for me. So that 45 is a recording that he did when he was in Alabama. It was by a band called the Alabama Cavaliers, which originally it was started back in the 30s by students at the University of Alabama to play at dances. It was a dance band. And then it just kind of evolved over the years. It had, like most of the great jazz players from the University of Alabama and around the state of Alabama were in that band. A really great arranger who did a lot of arranging for my big band later on. Steve Sample was a big part of that band. And so it's an arrangement of the tune Dixie that Willie did an arrangement of and then recorded. So, and he gave me, before he passed away, he gave me a couple of mementos to keep to remember him by, and that's one nice that I really treasure.
Very cool. Thank you for sharing that backstory. And you mentioned he was the first one who kind of put the trumpet in your hand. What was it about the trumpet? Because you think about, there's so many instruments one could pick up and play and stick with. What was it about the trumpet that really had an effect on you?
Well, one thing about the trumpet, and I think as a teacher, I've learned this over the years, you look at it and it only has 3 buttons. So you think, oh, it's got to be really easy to play. So that didn't really go into why I played the trumpet. I started playing the trumpet because I loved Willie. I thought he was the coolest guy in the room. You know, a couple of the other guys were kind of nerdy, kind of, musician types, and he was just cool. So I said, I want to try that thing. And luckily I just, I took to it like a duck to water. So it worked out perfectly.
Funny you brought up the fact that there's only 3 buttons, right? Appears like it could be really easy. That's why I chose trumpet when I first took bands. I thought, oh, easy, right? No.
Yeah.
Opposite of easy.
Yeah. I mean, with the woodwind instruments like clarinet and saxophone, there's a reed that vibrates, creates a sound. But with the trumpet and the trombone, all the other members of the brass family, you have to create the sound with your lips, and that involves a lot of practice and a lot of hard work. So,
sure. And in your early formative years, right? You grew up in Orlando, right?
Yeah, I was born in Panama City, but we moved to. My dad was in the military, and we moved to Orlando when I was 2, and I was raised there. I lived there until I moved to New York when I was 37. So I spent a lot of years in Orlando. I was there before Disney. It was just a quaint little town when I was growing up, and boy, did that change in the early 70s.
I imagine so. Yeah, that's how a lot of places, actually South Florida, was like that too. Once Miami started to really get a big boom, it changed quite a bit. So, but thinking about the early years in Orlando, What are some of your earliest memories of music? Who do you remember listening to back then, and who do you think had a big influence on you?
Well, until I got to high school, probably didn't have, I wasn't really searching out music very much. But I had a really great band director, Ed Smith, at Bishop Moore High School, where I went to school. And he had a jazz program there, and that's actually Willie Thomas came in and did a lot of mentoring at our school. And that's when I really caught the jazz bug. So I would start listening to recordings then. And then we were really fortunate because at that time there was a lounge out at Lake Buena Vista, the Village Lounge, and it was basically a waiting room for the really nice restaurant out there. And it was they brought in a different jazz artist every 2 or 3 weeks. And there was no cover charge. There was really no drink minimum. You could just sit on the couch and listen to these incredible national jazz artists come in and hang out with them on the break. It was kind of like a paid vacation for those guys. So they were just chilling. And so I got to meet a lot of great guys. Clark Terry, one of my great idols on the trumpet. I used to get to see him every year and hang out with him every year and take a lesson with him when I was getting a little bit older. So that was really priceless for us as young musicians in Orlando because and we talked a little bit about, especially back in that time, not too many touring bands came down through Florida. It was just, I think it was financially prohibitive. There weren't that many venues to play at. I always say when they would get to Atlanta and then take a right and go to New Orleans, and never get down to Florida. So for us, it was really, really, we were really lucky to have that experience.
What do you remember about your first jazz concert you ever saw?
That would have probably been one of those gigs out at the Village Lounge, but I remember in my own experience, we had one member of the jazz band at Bishop Moore. His father was a doctor, and he was a member of kind of an exclusive country club, and he hired our big band to play music at one of their functions one time, and that was the first time I really played jazz out in public. And it was scary, and at the same time it was thrilling just to improvise for the first time for other people besides parents, which is what we've been playing for before. So that was really cool.
Yeah. And thinking about that period, right? I mean, were there a lot of places to play out that catered to jazz? So you think of like local music scenes, you think of more like rock music, that sort of stuff. So was there that jazz scene going on at that time too?
Yeah, there were a few lounges like at hotels that and it wasn't a nightly thing. They would have one jazz night a week usually. But yeah, I think until I got a little older, I didn't really, I wasn't really able to search out a lot of clubs. But after I got back from college and started my own band, there are little hole in the wall places all over Central Florida that you could play. Sometimes you had to travel a bit. That's kind of the way the music business is and was in Florida. Luckily living in Orlando, I was 4 hours from Miami, and I was 2 or 3 hours from Jacksonville. I was an hour and a half from each coast. So I worked all over the state because I, could get there within 3 or 4 hours. So, and so you just had to travel and find the venues,
Sure. And that makes sense. Were your parents, were they fans of jazz, or were they into something different that may have also played influence in your early years too?
Yeah, not really. They were into some big band, but they were, we watched Lawrence Welk every Saturday night, and they would take me to a lot of places. Like before I could drive, they took me out to the Village Lounge at Lake Buena Vista. And they'd sit there for 2 or 3 hours and listen to jazz, and they were cool with it. But my mom was a good singer and played a little organ. My dad, not very musically inclined, although he did play pretty good harmonica. But yeah, I was lucky to get some big band exposure through records at home, but it was mostly once I got to high school and I really started experiencing a lot of different music.
Yeah. Was high school the first time you formed like your first actual band? Was that around that same time?
So I didn't form my own band, but I got into I guess we called them garage bands, and they were bands that just played dance music, rock and roll of the day, and so for me that was really great experience too, and a great time, because at that time, Chicago and Blood, Sweat and Tears and Earth, Wind and Fire and Tower of Power were all like powerful horn bands. So for a trumpet player, I got a lot of really great music to play. So that was didn't really form my own jazz band until I got back from college, probably. Yeah.
So did you all get a chance to play out in certain clubs at that point? Did you have any experience getting out there with some of these bands that you were playing more garage style?
It was almost all high school dances.
Okay.
I mean, back in those days, they hired live bands for dances.
Yeah.
There were no DJs. There was no real, iPods hadn't been discovered yet. So yeah, so I mean, we didn't work a lot, but maybe once a month we'd play a different dance, and we didn't, there wasn't really a festival circuit or anything back then either. So it was just high school dances, and but again, it was just great experience to get out and play and play some great music and get some applause and some feedback from the audience.
When you wrapped up high school, your next destination was University of Central Florida. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I was there for 3 years. They had a really great big band when I got there, and through my whole time there. My first couple years, the band director, Dr. Gerald Welker, was the band director, and he was tough, but man, he brought in some great music for us to play, and we play different conventions like the Florida Music Educators Association convention every year, and some really great players in that band. Dan Jordan, saxophone player, who I have played with my entire life, and who still is in Orlando. Herb Vaughn, who we've talked about, he was playing a lot of top 40, especially back in those days. A couple guys went on to work full time at Disney. Yeah, it was quite a band, and like I say, we got to experiment with it. At that time, Stan Kenton was one of the big bands that everybody was trying to play. So man, we played some really hard music from the Stan Kenton band. That really helped my playing a lot too.
Was this around the same time you were also working at Disney?
I started working like as a student musician then. Yeah. Like every Christmas I would work at Disney. That back then they would start about Thanksgiving, and it would go all the way through the New Year. And you worked, every weekend until the Christmas season, and then every day until New Year's. So I started out in the toy soldier band, which is, you wear this giant toy soldier outfit with a head, and you play this long 5-foot long fanfare trumpet, and it was dues, man. But eventually I started playing in some of the better bands, and but yeah, that was solid work every Christmas. It was really cool.
What was it like having to wear something like that in the Florida heat? Like, what was that experience like for you?
Well, it wasn't bad at Christmas time, but I'll tell you later, when I started working at Disney as a professional, doing a parade at 3:00 in the afternoon in the middle of the summer, wearing a wool marching band outfit with a hat was brutal.
I can imagine.
They got their money's worth out of us, that's for sure.
Yeah. At any point while you were in college at UCF, did you ever have any moments where you were considering maybe even changing from trumpet, maybe picking a different instrument, or were you just like set, like this is my instrument, like there's nothing else that I want to play, trumpet is it?
Yeah, no, I mean, it was always trumpet. I mean, I dabbled on piano a little bit, just mostly to learn some theory, and to later on when I started composing. But actually my undergrad degree is in accounting. So I was an accounting major while I was at UCF. I graduated in 3 years because back then you used to be able to test out of classes when you were in high school. So I got out of a lot of classes. So I got my degree in 3 years. And so kind of had a year to waste, and we didn't talk about gap years back then, but some friends of mine were going to North Texas State University in Denton to get in the music program, and I thought, man, I'll tag along, I'll go, and so went there, spent 3 semesters at North Texas, and that's where I really decided. I was an accountant for a year when I moved out there, and after a year, I decided, yeah, I don't think this is going to work out for me. So, and I was having so much fun playing after work with all the great musicians there. I finally said, I'm going to give this thing a shot, and
Yeah.
that's how I really pulled the trigger and said, okay, I'm going to try and make a living playing the trumpet.
Describe the scene when you were in college around the Orlando area, the different venues, the different places that were around. Maybe not just so much just for jazz, but just in general. What do you remember from that period? And were there any places that really stand out that maybe you played, maybe you saw a show at? What kind of stands out in your memory?
Yeah, again, I think, most of my college days, I was either, studying or practicing for concerts and stuff like that. So I still didn't go out to a lot of venues then, and it wasn't until after I graduated and got back from North Texas that I started going out more concerts. It kind of fell into the top 40 thing there for a little while. So, there was what was the Why Not Lounge out in Altamont Springs was a big venue. The Cheek to Cheek at the Villanova restaurant in Winter Park, which is where I played for a couple of years. There was a couple of old music halls in downtown Orlando that were really cool, that would bring in some national acts. And there was a club called Valentine's down on Orange Avenue in Orlando. And they brought in a lot of acts. And also that was a chance for a lot of local bands to play at. So that's where I started kind of getting to play a little bit there too.
One of the pictures you sent me was of one of your early bands, Kiwi Guru.
Yeah.
And a show at Decades there. So that was in Winter Park, right?
Yeah, that was right on Park Avenue. Really, just a hole in the wall. Almost dirt floors kind of thing. And there was a little room in the back that they would have acts play. And again, not really a jazz room. They had all kinds of alternative and rock stuff. But we had a steady gig there for a year or two. That was my first real band of my own that I formed. Very eclectic. It was guitar and vibes. The vibes player and the bass player were in the Florida Symphony Orchestra. One was my roommate, the bass player. And we played some of my original. I'm starting to write some original tunes by then, but also a lot of very eclectic jazz pieces that no one else was playing. I love to play all the songs from the Great American Songbook, and I love to play Miles Davis and all these great artists. But there are so many guys that were under the radar, and I liked a lot of their tunes, and so started just trying to pick and choose and find the sound that I wanted to be working with.
What was your favorite Miles period?
Man, that's hard. I would say probably the early 60s. So like when he formed the band with Ron Carter, Tony Williams, Herbie Hancock, Wayne Shorter, when they were still playing jazz standards, but they were really tearing them apart and really playing them in different ways. I love the 50s Miles with Coltrane, and that they were playing all the Great American Songbook tunes. But when he transitioned and kind of morphed the style a little bit with that second quintet, that was that was a really exciting time in jazz history, I think.
Did you have a favorite Miles song to play out live?
Boy, again, there's so many of them. It's not a Miles tune, but it's a tune that he played a bunch. It's a Wayne Shorter tune called Footprints. I've been playing that tune forever. The early days, one of his first tunes, I still love playing that tune. And he again, because his career lasted so long, he had so many different periods and so many great songs in all those periods. It's really hard to just settle on one, you know.
Sure, of course. Yeah, I wasn't sure if there was one that stood out that, you just seem to gravitate more to live, but that makes sense. And, you're mentioning a lot of these different places in the Orlando area. At what point in your career did you start to venture outside of Central Florida and start to experiment with some other places throughout the state?
Well, again, there were some places over on the East Coast, in Melbourne. Was it the Lazy Bean was a venue over there that was really open to whatever you wanted to play. So we could go a little bit more avant-garde over there. Played a lot over in the Tampa, Sarasota area, not just in, jazz venues, but a lot of Latin bands, salsa bands. And I got up, and then when I was starting to do some more blues work, a venue up in Jacksonville, Apple Jacks was a really great place to go up and play. Tobacco Road down in Miami was really a great blues venue. So yeah, I think it kind of also depended on what music I was, because especially as a trumpet player, you got to freelance and you got to cover every genre to make it as a professional.
Sure.
So I think as I played the different genres and different bands, and that kind of led me to a lot of different venues, and then sometimes you get your foot in the door there, and then you could bring in your own band to play your own stuff then.
Did you notice any differences in the crowds depending on where in Florida you were playing?
A little bit. I mean, again, I think the Tampa Bay area there's so much great Latin music there. The crowds are really enthusiastic, and a lot of dancing at those venues. So that was really cool. I think Miami's they're so metropolitan, man. You get a whole bunch of different people to come out and see you there, so I think it kind of depends on the cultural scene in each area too. I mean, play over on the beach and on the East Coast, man, you're going to get a bunch of hippies and beach bums, and they're loving the music just like everybody else. So it was really cool to see, a really cross section of the state in the audiences.
I think you also told me before that you had also played all the way down in the Keys too. So was there any difference between, playing, because you think that especially down there, maybe more tourists and stuff like that? Did you notice that was kind of a different feel when you play down in the Keys?
A little bit, but I think again, we're talking like, mid 80s. I don't know if it had really caught on as a tourist destination. I mean, Key West, there were definitely some tourist things there, but again, all those lifers that live in Key West, I mean, they were, hardcore, just like a mellow hang, because that's what the Keys was all about, So yeah, so a night at Sloppy Joe's down in Key West could be really different every night, depending on what cross section of the groove of the people showed up that night.
How did you approach the set list, right? Because you would think that based on where you're playing, you might try to cater more to that local audience. Was that ever something that was in your mind as you were creating the set list of what you wanted to play based on where you were playing?
Yeah, sure. I mean, again, over on the West Coast, I might try to work some more bossa novas or sambas in, just to appeal to the Latin crowd a little bit more. Again, over on the East Coast, maybe a little bit more avant-garde. We let our hair down a little bit more there. When I was down in the Keys, that was all with the blues bands. So it was, our set list didn't change too much. It was just, Southern blues and let loose.
And speaking of the blues, you had quite some time over with Bob Greenlee in King Snake Studios. How did you get acquainted with him, and just talk about some of the time you spent working with his label in the studio?
Yeah, I think I went and sat in, the cornet player Nat Adderley was on the scene then, and I loved Nat's playing, so I heard he was playing, and he was just kind of an adjunct to this blues band, and So I went and sat in, and I met Bob then, and so I just, we kind of exchanged information, and he said, I got this studio in Sanford, and I don't know if you'd be interested in coming out and recording. And at that point, wasn't doing a lot. I was still just kind of getting my feet firmly on the ground, and so I said, sure, yeah, let me know. And so yeah, I started going out there, and I was out there many times every month for the next many years, because recording a blues album out there was a very slow process. There was no charts. There was not even a tune when we would start. We'd start with a riff and then add this and add this and that. So it was a lot of all-nighters and just kind of building by block at a time kind of thing. But yeah, I spent a lot of time out there, and got to play with some really great blues musicians, and I learned a lot about recording and how to record and the techniques and everything. So it was, again, very educational, and on top of being a blast.
Who were some of the other local musicians you remember from that period that you had a chance to play a lot with, just in the studio with King Snake?
Well, one of the big ones was Noble Thin Man Watts. He was kind of a legend. He was from D-Land, Florida. And he had been, on the blues circuit for, at that time, I don't know how old he was. I thought he was 70 or 80. He was just, he was an old veteran of the trade, and so yeah, it was a blast hanging out with him, and I learned a lot about the blues and how not to play so many notes. He used to yell at me because I was a young jazz musician, so I wanted to play everything that I knew, and he'd yell at me, no, you can't do that, man. So he was great. Ernie Lancaster, guitar player, extraordinary. I got to play a lot with him. Yeah, and then just a bunch of the kind of national blues artists that weren't Floridians, Lucky Peterson and Kenny Neal, and yeah, so I got to play with a lot of different blues cats, because like every other genre, there's like a Florida blues, there's a kind of a Southern blues, there's a Memphis blues, and so all the different guys we recorded for all brought like a different thing to the game, and Taj Mahal, we did a thing with Taj Mahal that was really cool. So yeah, I just got exposed to, again, a whole new range of music that I didn't know about before.
So really, prior to that, you weren't really that into the blues, is that right? Or maybe something you really weren't that focused in on. It was more so just, jazz was your thing, right?
Yeah, jazz. We play blues in jazz too, but it's I don't know, it's much more ethereal, I guess, than just the down home blues that is a true rhythm and blues band,
Yeah.
So yeah, so I learned a lot in those days.
When you were playing with a lot of these different musicians on the blues side of things, did you have any memorable gigs where maybe you played out with some of these other blues musicians?
Oh yeah, we used to have great gigs. There was a place called Skippers over on the West Coast that we used to play with a lot of different artists, and those were always great crowds. It was kind of an outdoor venue. The stage was outdoors, and the crowd was all just gathered around. That was really, really cool. We got to play on the same bill as James Brown over in Daytona Beach for spring break. That was great. Yeah, and then the band started traveling a lot, so we played up and down the East Coast a couple of times. You mentioned Key West, so we played from as far south to Key West and as far north as New York City. We played CBGB's up in New York.
Wow, what was that like? Considering that CBGB's is more associated with punk rock and rock music, so what was that like for you playing a venue as famous as CBGB's?
Oh, it was great, it's a tiny place. It's not that big a place, and of course the New York crowd was just crazy. They were wild, man. It was really great. Another one I really liked was that was very memorable. we also played quite a bit with Root Boy Slim, who had gone to Yale with Bob Greenlee, and so they had a band back at Yale, and they were called the Midnight Creepers, I think Midnight Creepers. So he renamed his Florida band after those days, and so after Root Boy had quite a cult following back in the day, and so he was a little past his famous time when he was playing with the Creepers, but we played a gig at the Marble Bar in Baltimore one day. This was mid '80s, and it was like an all concrete venue, like it was in the basement of some hotel, and it was just gray concrete. There was nothing except concrete wall and columns,
Wow.
And so that was kind of a little bit of like, wow, okay, I guess this is cool, but it was a little weird.
That sounds very Baltimore. Yeah. From what I've heard. So you mentioned the Midnight Creepers. So here's a copy of this. I think that this is the first Midnight Creepers record, and you are right there.
Yeah, right next to Bob. Yeah.
Yeah. So this was taken. You mentioned this picture was taken in Key West.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. So when we were talking about this now, although you weren't credited on this record, you said you couldn't remember if you played on it, right?
I don't think I did. I think they recorded that like before I, was a member of the band even, but I guess they, in the time lapse between the recording and the album cover, that was the shot that they had. So
yeah, this came out in 1987. That's when this was released.
Yeah. But I don't think I played on that, but
yeah. And I have to go back and listen to it again because I tried to see if I could hear the trumpet, and I've had the record for a long time, and I have to go back and really listen to it again to see if I can isolate just the trumpet.
Yeah. But well, please tell me if I'm on
it. You're definitely on the cover though, so I imagine maybe you are on it. I don't know.
Maybe so.
So
and we recorded so much back in those days. It's hard to really recollect all the different artists and all the different albums that we did.
Sure. And thinking about that, for you, what did you prefer most? Did you prefer playing more in the studio, or was there something about the live performance that was more your style of playing?
Yeah, I mean, I always love playing live. You just first of all, I mean, the music is more spontaneous. I think that's really important with music. I mean, it's important to document the music too, but yeah, I dig the spontaneity and the interaction between the band and between the band and the audience. It really creates a lot of different energy that you can feed off of, and so I've always loved playing live.
Yeah, I can imagine. And you did quite a bit in the studio. There's definitely stuff out there, and one in particular that maybe some people aren't aware of is this Secret Weapons record, where you are credited as playing trumpet on this record. What do you remember from this album? Do you remember getting in the studio, and what was that like? What you can remember from contributing to this album?
Yeah, that was another one where it was just piece by piece we built some of those tunes, and yeah, we were making up horn parts kind of as we went along, and again, that's one I had totally forgotten about that album until you brought it back to my attention. And I actually even called or texted Dan Walters to ask him about it. He's not even really sure if he has. I think all he has is reel-to-reel tapes.
Wow. And it's a cool record, because I would say it's different because it's not really blues, it's not really jazz. I mean, it's not really either of those two. It's more, I guess, rock oriented. It has like an 80s sound, but not stereo. I don't know. It's hard to explain because there's like different styles of music on that, especially when you factor in some of the, like the trumpet, right? I mean, not something I was expecting to hear. So, did you ever play live with them, or that was just studio only, and that was about
Yeah,
it?
yeah, that was just a quick thing. But yeah, I think it was kind of alternative. I mean, there were
Yeah.
the the rhythmic thing was kind of alternative. Just the whole approach was kind of just trying to be different. And Dan Walters is another one, man. He's really active on the Central Florida scene now. He's still working constantly. He's a great guy.
And you also had a chance to travel outside the US, right? Europe,
Uh-huh.
Japan. Uh, Talk about that for a little bit too. And what were some of those experiences like? And any fond memories you have about touring outside of the US?
Well, I love being outside of the U.S. My wife and I still travel every year, and we try to go to Europe or someplace every year. The first time I got to Europe was with the King Snake record label. They called it the King Snake Caravan, and it was several of their stars. It was Lucky Peterson and Kenny Neal. Noble Watts, Yvonne Jackson was singing. And so we started by a little Canadian tour. We went to Montreal and Toronto, Victoria and Vancouver. And then we flew into Glasgow, and we played the Glasgow Jazz and Blues Festival. That was really a blast. Moseyed around a whole bunch, went down to a studio in Baden-Baden, Germany, and recorded a TV show, which was really cool. The day that we recorded, the band that recorded right before us was Shaka Khan. So we didn't meet Shaka, but we got to hang out with her band a little bit, and ended up in Stockholm. So we got to see a lot of, the tour was 3 weeks long, and we got to see a lot of cool venues, and just to experience some different cultures, and then and when I moved to New York, actually before I moved to New York, I started doing Broadway shows in Europe, and so same thing, which was really cool because we would sit in each city for 2 or 3 months at a time, so you could really get to know. Like I know Munich so well because I've been there 3 or 4 times for 2 or 3 months at a time. So to get to know a city like that was really cool. And of course, I met all kinds of musicians that I would later work in New York with. But so most of the first half of the 90s, I was doing shows on and off in Europe, and then had a couple of years off, and then went back and did one in 96, 97, and met my wife on one of those shows. So that was really cool. And then moved
What location did you meet her?
Munich.
Munich. Okay.
Yeah, we were doing the show 42nd Street, and I was playing the lead trumpet, and she was one of the lead actresses. So it was kind of like a Broadway show written.
Nice. What were some of those crowds like playing over in Europe?
They're amazing. Like at the end of the show, I have this ongoing joke. In the United States, after you play the bows, when the actors take their final bow and the curtain comes down, then the band plays exit music. We play music from the show for, I don't know, 3 or 4 minutes and we call in the United States, we get a leading ovation for that because people are like out the door. In Europe, they would gather around the pit and look down into the pit and watch us play the exit music. And I had one time in Munich, a lady invited us to lunch on Monday on our day off, and served us all this great German food. And, they really, I mean, I know it's a kind of a blanket statement, but they really seem to appreciate the arts and musicians so much in Europe. So that was so cool. And we were lucky we had Monday nights off, so we would find a jazz venue, and one of the guys had brought a little jazz band book, and we go play. And again, man, the appreciation for jazz, this was back in the early 90s, they couldn't get enough. They were so excited to have Americans in town playing jazz. So yeah, it was so cool.
Yeah. Was there a place maybe when you were over there that you just didn't get to play that you wish you could have?
Um, well, we didn't get to play in Paris because the Paris Musicians Union would only allow Parisians to play, only let French play. And the same thing in Vienna. So, but I mean, I visited both those places a ton, and I actually, later on, I would sit in at jazz clubs in Paris, so I got to do some playing there. Um,
And you also played Japan too, right?
yeah, so after I moved to New York, I was doing the show Chicago a lot. I just subbed that show a lot, and so they were doing a tour to Tokyo, a 3 week stand in Tokyo, and so got hired to play that, and so yeah, we were in Tokyo for 3 weeks, and again, just so cool to eat all the different food and experience the busyness of Tokyo, which makes New York seem like Omaha, Nebraska. Um, and I got to sit in, got to play with some guys there, and again, they're jazz freaks, man. They love jazz so much there. So, and again, boy, nobody moved after the show. Everybody sat in their seat and listened to the band play the exit music. So again, great appreciation for the arts there.
Yeah, I've heard a lot of stories from other people when they play over in Japan, just different feel audience wise compared to maybe playing in the US, especially when it comes to just the respect of the music. And I think as a real contrast to Japan and to Europe, I think I also read you played in the Caribbean, right?
Yeah, I mean that was cruise ships. I mean back in the day
Yeah.
that was a gig, and
What was that like playing on a cruise ship?
for me it was okay because I never like signed up for a long-term contract. I was at that time I was doing pretty well in Orlando, and so the guy who booked the cruises down from Lauderdale and Miami, he would call me if he had a guy that needed to get out for a week or two or three. And so I would go down and just sub for him, which was cool because when you do a cruise ship gig, your accommodations are like down in the bowels of the ship, and it's like a little 4x8 room,
Oh
and
man.
it's dark, and it's not very pleasant. But when I would go on as a sub, I'd tell them, man, I need a room. I need a regular room, and he was cool because he knew I could just go in and nail the gig and get in and out, and it was cool. So, but yeah, I mean, I got to see all the islands down in there, and again, usually I would have passenger and crew status, so I could like do the day trips wherever we were. I got to ride on a America's Cup yacht one time, and yeah, so it was. I mean, it was a great chance to get to see the Caribbean and make a little money. Those gigs don't pay very much money, but you also don't have very many expenses either. So
I was going to ask that question. What was the pay like playing a cruise versus maybe playing a club or even playing a show in Japan or in Europe? What was some of the differences there between some of those paid gigs?
yeah, I mean, cruise ships have always been kind of the low pay. I think back then they were paying $300 a week, I think. But again, especially if you were a young musician, it was a good chance to make some money and save a little bit of money because you wouldn't, you could sublet your apartment or whatever and keep most of the money that you made. Clubs notoriously don't pay very well, especially for jazz gigs. A lot of them are you get paid the cover charge. Sometimes they'll even take part of the cover charge away from you. So yeah, you're not going to make very much money there. For me, the Broadway shows, one of the best paying things, that and club dates. We in the Northeast we call them club dates, weddings, bar mitzvahs, and you make pretty good money for those. But there's a lot of unless you're playing like a big artist, and which is usually going to be concert stage kind of things. I mean, I did a lot of work with Natalie Cole over the years, and she always paid well, of course. But yeah, just working in clubs. It's you're doing it, more for the love of the music and to perform than to make very much money.
Were there any other memories or things that are fond to you that maybe you played outside of those locations in the US? Like, did you ever go out west and play before you moved out that way, of course? Like, did you have any tours playing other places in the United States?
Yeah, I mean, not too much. Like I say, mostly the East Coast thing. I visited a friend in Chicago a couple times, and we would always play gigs there, but nothing really very organized. The only time I got out west before I moved here was back in the day when Tupperware was kind of still a big thing. There, they had a headquarters in Kissimmee, Florida. And so every year they would have these big conventions where ladies who sold Tupperware would come in for 3 or 4 days at a time and, talk about the products and giveaways and all that stuff. And there was a pit band. There was always a pit band there for play-ons and playoffs and background music and everything. And so a couple times they came out to California to do a convention out there. So they would, I guess it was cheaper for them just to hire the Orlando cats and fly them out there than to try to get LA cats, because the scale would have been so much higher. So yeah, that was the first time I'd gotten out west, was thanks to Tupperware.
How does that conversation go when someone approaches you and says, yeah, we want you to be the part of the pit band for Tupperware? Like, how?
Well, see, again, man, for us back in those days, that was a good paying gig, because it was all day long. And it was, they would have like many of these 3-day, sessions. And so I forget, it might have been 2 weeks worth of work, maybe even more, but it was all day, every day. And so, you racked up some good money doing it. I mean, it was obviously, some of it was kind of just mindless playing. But yeah, so I mean, that was a gig that everybody wanted. And when I it took a long time before I finally got called for it. And when I did, I was like, and again, just the best players in town, so yeah, it was cool. And, and there was some fun stuff too. Some of these things when, they would make presentations to the Tupperware ladies, and there would be like, 400 ladies would come across the stage to accept their little thing. And you would just play one tune for like half hour or something, and you play the melody, and a bunch of people would solo, and then you play the melody, and then a bunch more people would solo. So, you got a chance to do some soloing and to do some playing in between the monotonous part. But yeah, that was a treasured gig back in those days.
Yeah. Interesting. I never knew there was such a thing as a Tupperware pit.
Yeah. It's weird.
Yeah, that's definitely interesting. With all the time you had traveled, right, both domestically and internationally, was there anyone along that you just traveled a lot with where just funny story, that maybe there were any kind of pranks that were played? Like, did you all get into that sort of stuff? Like, was there anything like that had taken place when you were traveling with all these different characters and personalities over the years?
Yeah, I mean, for me, there were a lot of day trips, like when we would have our day off on Mondays when we were doing a Broadway show. I would always just catch the S-Bahn, the train that goes out into the rural or suburb area around all these different cities. So I used to love to do that, and there would be a group of 3 or 4 of us, like, especially like in Germany, that were beer lovers. And so we would try to go to all these old famous breweries, like one of my favorites is Andechs. It's a monastery outside of Munich that until a few years ago, they didn't even export their beer into other parts of Germany. It was only in Munich that you could get this beer. So I used to always go out there. Weihenstephan, which is the oldest brewery in the world, 1040 is when it was they first started brewing there. So yeah, and it was always kind of, you always found the guys who liked to do those kind of outreach things, and one of my favorite was when I did Chicago in Japan. My partner in crime on that one was a trombone player named Dave Panicki, which, if you know of the famous Buddy Rich bus tapes, he's the one who is kind of the instigator and major opponent on that one. So yeah, we had a blast in Tokyo for 3 weeks.
I bet. Yeah. Well, that sounds a lot of fun. And then, so, the whole beer thing, are you still a fan of trying different beers across the world?
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, I've been homebrewing since 2001. So
Oh, wow.
When I was in New York, I did a lot of competitive brewing. I entered a lot of competitions, and one of my beers won the Knickerbocker State brewing competition, and they actually I brewed a jalapeno pale ale, which at that time nobody was using peppers in beer. Now you see pepper beers a lot, but so yeah, that won best in show, and they brewed a batch of my beer up in Albany at a brewery. So that was
Wow.
Cool. But
That is pretty cool.
I am a beer lover, and I love tasting all kinds of beers, and especially out here in Seattle, it's kind of IPA central. So if you're an India Pale Ale lover, this is a good place to be.
Have you ever came out with a Florida inspired beer?
No, because again, I didn't start brewing till I was in New York. So not a Florida style beer. I did do a jazz series of beers that I brewed with famous jazz musicians in mind. So I brewed a Clifford Brown ale. I brewed for Miles, I brewed a Prince of Darkness stout.
Nice.
So back in the day, that the musicians who had drinking problems, who were alcoholics, they called them hop heads. So, and it didn't really have anything to do with hops that you brew beer with. It was just the terminology. So Bix Beiderbecke was a really famous guy that they called. So I made one called Old Hophead with his picture on it. So, and the Cole Porter, that was another of the musicians series. So nothing from Florida, but there's a little musician related beer.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Well, there's still time. You never know. You might want to just pay homage to your old home state with a Florida inspired beer. There you go.
I will take that into consideration.
All right. So I want to just kind of talk a little bit about your transition to teaching, because there's been a lot of people who have I've had on the podcast before, who later on in their life became educators. So how did you make that transition from being a musician playing out to all these different places and recording in studios to wanting to get into teaching?
Well, I mean, and I taught a little bit when I was in Florida and a tiny little bit in New York. But when I moved out here, the scene in Seattle is not great to make a living. I mean, there's a lot of places to play if you want to play for free or play for the door. But just there, I could see I wasn't going to be able to make the living that I was making before. And so, I mean, one thought I had before I moved out here, because I pretty much knew that it was going to be that way. So I actually had considered trying to start brewing professionally when I came out here. Even maybe have my own brew pub, but then I discovered it would be $250,000 startup fee, and I probably couldn't do that. So, I met a trumpet player on a gig, and he said, "No, I'm leaving this music school. Do you want to start, teaching my students?" I said, "Yeah, I'll give it a shot." And so it was cool. That happened for a couple of years, and then the music school that I was teaching at wanted to start a jazz program. So I got to start the jazz program and figure out the curriculum and do it my way. And so that was really cool. I really enjoyed that. So yeah, and I've been teaching ever since then out here. And it's, a lot of great students I've had. It's been very fulfilling. and you still get to play a lot. I mean, you're playing during lessons, so it's I kind of like that you're still hands-on with the trumpet anyway.
Is there any kind of mental shift that you have to take going from what you were doing to teaching?
I don't think so. I mean, I think teaching is if you're good at it, it has to be individual. I mean, you have to have your own approach. I'm sure there are teachers who, teach in a standard way that, has been done repetitively for how many decades. But for me, I teach my own way. I teach a lot because of my experience, and I think I also realized just from my own experience that, like, catering to each individual student is really important. So I mean, my lesson plan there, I don't have a single lesson plan. I have, if I have 18 students, I've got 18 different lesson plans because each kid needs something different, or wants something different. So I think for me, just flexibility in teaching has been really important.
Have any of your students stumbled upon any of your prior work when you were still in Florida?
A little bit, yeah. And some of my New York stuff too, especially. But yeah, and then I would play them cuts from different tunes that I had recorded and stuff like that. And yeah, and I'm lucky, again, not too many people go into the music business, and especially now I would never try to push anybody into a career in music, and even less so now, just because the music business is getting tougher and tougher and tougher, but I had a couple students that have gone on to become professional musicians. I have one, she's really, really doing great. She went to Berklee School of Music in Boston. She got to sit in and play with Chick Corea while she was there. She moved to New York and started doing got into a good wedding band. So she started making money right away. And she's become a really great innovator on the synthesizer. She has some things going on that are kind of really new. So she was on John Legend's last CD. She did a week with the late night band with Jimmy Fallon, I guess that is.
The Roots.
Yeah, sitting in with that band. And she's been out with this female vocalist, Claro, which I had never heard of before, but they tour a lot. So she's making it, which makes me really proud, because not too many people can do it anymore,
Right. Yeah, that's got to be, obviously one of the most rewarding aspects of being a teacher is having those students, or any student for that matter, but especially the ones that wind up really making it in that way. And you think back to, their very green periods of their just getting started, and you having a huge hand in that beginning. So,
and the majority of the students you never hear from after they graduate, because they go on to other things, So yeah, so it's good to have one every once in a while that you can kind of follow and see what they're doing,
I think you sent me 2 tracks from a demo album that you. I guess it was enough songs for an album, right?
Yeah, I mean, they were pretty short. I mean, we didn't really stretch on the solos. I tried to keep the lengths of the tunes short, because again, I was going to use it to try and get club work, and so you needed to have some project to put in their hand.
Yeah.
So there were 7 tunes, but they were pretty short,
I liked the 2 that you sent, and I think you mentioned that there were 1 or 2 guys on that demo that were from Florida.
Yeah, well, the saxophone and flute player, Dan Jordan, he's still in Orlando, still working all the time. And the drummer at that time he had moved to New York even before I did, and so he was living in New York, but he was originally from the west coast of Florida, and now he's returned home. He's gone back to the west coast, and he's working a lot over in the Tampa, St. Pete.
What was his name?
John Jenkins. And he stays busy over in that area of Florida. So those guys were Florida Florida guys, and then
Yeah.
the bass player and the piano player were New York, just New York guys.
Okay. Yeah, I liked what I heard, and for those that are listening to the podcast, if you were watching the podcast, make sure you check out the audio only version too, because on that one you will hear an intro and an outro of two songs off of the demo, which was never actually released, right, Bruce?
No, I just use it to try to get work.
It's always crazy to me as an outsider looking in, having heard so many demos over the years, and so many of them never saw the light of day. And then you hear them, you're like, to that person who's listening who didn't create it, you're like, how can this not have been released, at least where people could hear it? So maybe someday you'll have that out somewhere where people can at least stream it and check out what you put together, because I like what I heard.
Oh, yeah. I mean, the only thing my wife and I recorded a big band CD before we left New York. And that one was released, and you can check it out on Spotify and all the platforms now. But yeah, that was the only one that we released for mass consumption.
As we kind of round things out, I want to ask you just some quick final questions here. Thinking about all the different places you had a chance to play in Florida, was there one that really just stood out as it was your favorite one, that you ever had a chance to play while you were in Florida?
Well, there was a club in Winter Park called Dexter's. I think it's still there. It was a wine bar. And they used to have jazz things there quite a bit, and a bunch of us played in different bands there over the years, and so I always loved playing that venue. And there was one specific one, another great trumpet player who lived in Orlando named Jerry Tyree. He was on Maynard Ferguson's Dreamland band back in the late 1950s. He played in New York a long time too. Great bebop trumpet player, and so he had a two trumpet book. He had a band that had two trumpets, and so when the previous guy had been playing the gig left town, he called me to do the gig, and so playing two trumpets with another really great trumpet player was really cool. And then one night, Willie Thomas was back in town, and he had a young phenom trumpet player named Ryan Kaiser, who's now in New York. He plays in Wynton Marsalis's Lincoln Center Jazz Orchestra, and he's just a top shelf guy. So they came in, and we did a four trumpet battle on a few tunes, and it was pretty awesome.
Wow. How long does something like that go on for?
Oh, I mean, each tune would be 10, 15 minutes probably, I guess. Yeah, it was quite a gig. I'll never forget that one.
What's your recovery process after doing something like that?
And it's not that bad, because you play your solo, and then while the other guys play your solo, you're resting. So it's not, and it's just, for me, it was just mentally, it was just so great, because you got to listen. I got to listen to this great bebop trumpet player. Then I got to listen to Willie Thomas, who was another great bebop trumpet player, who was my mentor. And then I got to hear this young phenom who was just playing his butt off, and so it was just like, it was thrilling to just be on stage with all this great trumpet stuff, and I'm just trying to get in there.
Was there a place in Florida that perhaps you never got a chance to play, that for whatever reason, and you wish in hindsight you did get a chance to play there?
I don't think so, because I got to play all the big concert halls. When touring acts would come through, they would play around the state, so all the big venues, Van Wezel Hall and Ruth Eckerd Hall and the King Center over in Melbourne, Bob Carr Auditorium in Orlando. So I got to play all those big venues, and there, I think there weren't any jazz most of the jazz venues were just little clubs, and I played most of those too. So yeah, I think I ticked off most of the boxes when I was there.
Uh, if there was one record, one jazz record that you would want one of your students to listen to, what record would come to mind right away as the one you would recommend to them?
Boy, that's another tough one. I would say John Coltrane's Blue Train, because it was a sextet. It had Coltrane, Lee Morgan on trumpet, and Curtis Fuller on trombone. They did a couple of the famous John Coltrane tunes with his special changes on it. Everybody plays great on that record. It's exciting. It's energetic. Yeah, I mean, that's one of, I always think if I had to take 10 albums on a desert island, that would definitely have to be one of them.
That was the earliest jazz record I remember listening to. And there was something about the Blue Note covers themselves that just had something about them that sparked this mystery, this mystique or this interest. Like, what does this sound like? And that happened with me with Blue Train.
Yeah, no, it's a special album. And yeah, I love those Blue Note albums. That's what I still miss most, about digital music and even CDs was, I like holding that album. I like the smell of the cardboard. I like to be able to read the story. That was always, and like you say, the album covers, for those Blue Note albums they were so cool.
Yeah. This might be a tough question, but thinking about just those labels, right? Those jazz labels like Blue Note, Prestige, Riverside, Dial. I mean, there's so many, right? The list can go on, right? Did you have one in particular where you were more of a fan of, that you followed more of the jazz musicians on that particular label?
Well, I mean, I think Blue Note was at the top just because there was so many great recordings done. And like you say, the albums themselves were really cool. Those early Prestige, I love those. The Columbia things that Miles did in the 60s were great, which also had great album covers. Like usually his wife or his girlfriend or something would be on them. But yeah, I think it always goes back to Blue Note just because that's the core. That's where the roots are, But yeah, I would have to say that. And I'd also have to say, I would have to bring Milestones would be another album that would have to come with me. I mean, that's like right behind or next to Blue Train. Those are two hard ones to pick apart,
Yeah, I know it's not easy. I don't like asking those questions. I know it can be really tough to narrow it down to just one, because what you say today, I could ask you that same question next week and your answer could be completely different.
Yeah. But I mean, I like the challenge. And I used to, I challenge my students the same way, and but usually I usually try to list, say top 3 or something like that, just because the one to pick is just it's so hard.
It's tough. Yeah, it's tough. Well, it's been great having you on, Bruce. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to tell the story of your life and your experiences and the history of your music and what you've done over the years. I think a lot of this is undocumented, so you can't just go on to Wikipedia and find a page about Bruce Staelens. So this is important, and for those that are listening to the podcast or watching it, hopefully you walked away with something you didn't know, you learned something new. Maybe even some of your students who check this out, they will walk away with things that they didn't know about their teacher, which is always fun.
Cool. Yeah. Thanks for having me. And thanks for, thinking about Florida music. I mean, there was a lot happening in the past. There's still a lot happening now, I'm sure. But it's such kind of a remote area of the country that a lot of people will never hear about. And so I think you doing this show is really important because it opens up. I mean, it made me remember about a lot of stuff in Florida from the old days too. So I appreciate the work that you're doing, man.
Thanks, Bruce. Definitely appreciate that. And on that note, kind of closing out the interview, I'd like to turn over to you. Any closing remarks you want to share to just fans of yours over the years, supporters, maybe people who just been around? Anything you want to close out the interview with? I will turn it over to you.
Yeah, not really. I mean, just for all the people that remember me from the old days, I hope this has jogged your memory of some things, and maybe I'll hear from some of these people with some comments, and you forgot to mention this one, or what about this guy, or whatever. But mostly, I mean, my message, as it always is to people, is enjoy music. I mean, in this crazy world that we live in now, music brings us peace and joy and happiness, and so enjoy music as much as you can, and go out and listen to live music as much as you can. That's another art form that's on the decline, I think. And it doesn't have to be jazz or blues or whatever we talk about. I still go to hear the symphony orchestra as often as I can, because, music is what makes the world a better place, I think. So enjoy music every day of your life.